Becoming more self-aware is like exploring space. And
Yeah.
what I love about it and what makes it so exciting is no matter what we know, there's always more to discover. I work with senior executives, CEOs, the C-suite, to help them be more effective and successful and to help build better cultures and better places to work that are more successful as well. Self-awareness is the will and skill to understand who we are and how we're seen. And what's really interesting about these two camera angles or two elements of self-awareness is there is no relationship between them. The most powerful self-awareness or insight-producing moments aren't these huge light bulb moments where all of a sudden we understand everything.
Yeah.
They're just small incremental improvement. The more people introspected, right, the more they self-reflected, the less self-aware they were, and the less happy, the more stressed, the more depressed, the more anxious they were.
Gabor Maté has done a lot of good work in that space. He says that trauma is not what happens to you. It is what happens to you inside as a response to what's happening outside of you.
One thing we know about trauma is it's not just a psychological injury, it's an injury to our nervous system.
Hey, Tasha, such a pleasure having you here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to talk to you.
Pleasure is all mine, Tasha. And you won't believe it, but the subject that we are going to talk about that you have written about on awareness in your second book called Insight has played a vital role in my life. I tell people that self-awareness is the best gift that you can offer to yourself or to the other person. Before we even dwell into that subject, help me understand. When was the first time you got introduced to this term called awareness?
So in some ways, I was introduced to awareness, when I started my career, which was now, 22 years ago. And primarily, I work with senior executives, CEOs, the C-suite, to help them be more effective and successful and to help build better cultures and better places to work that are more successful as well. And what I noticed over time was that there were basically two types of executives. And I would soon learn two types of people in general, right? The first group were doing the best they could every day. They were fighting fires, they were showing up, they were trying their best, but they were not spending conscious time and attention questioning, right? Who am I? How am I coming across? Getting more information about those things, challenging the assumptions they have about those things. And then the second group was, right? So they were getting feedback, they were reflecting in productive ways. They never felt like they had fully arrived at seeing themselves clearly. And to a person, that first group would often be successful, but two things would happen. Either one, they would get stuck, right, at some point, or two, they would crash and burn, right? They get promoted to just above their competence. They don't have the self-awareness to understand what they need to do. And then, something bad happens. The second group, though, they weren't just more successful and effective, they were happier. They had more self-acceptance, more humility, more ability to show empathy to other people. And so, when this term self-awareness started to become a buzzword, gosh, this is probably 15 years ago now, I started to wonder, what do we know scientifically about this concept? Because I had seen the difference, but what I didn't know is, were all the platitudes that were out there in the media actually true? And, we'll talk about this, but my research team uncovered that a lot of the things we think we know about self-awareness are actually wrong.
Yeah, yeah. So I would love to hear more about that. That what are the myths that we have been holding for this term called self-awareness? But help me understand today, as well as you mentioned, there are two kinds of people that you have come across, two kinds of executives that you have come across. At times, I find it extremely difficult to even define self-awareness for people who are not even introduced to this term called awareness. Please give me your definition so that I can share that definition with those who don't understand this. Would you please help me?
Happily, happily. And you're right. It's interesting because it took our research team almost 1 year to scientifically define this term of self-awareness. I was so naive. I thought, oh, we'll just read some journal articles and
Yeah.
we'll come up with a definition. It wasn't that simple. So this is simplicity on the other side of complexity, right? A lot went into this. Self-awareness is the will and skill to understand who we are and how we're seen. The will and skill to understand who we are on the inside and then how we're seen by others.
Yeah. Yeah. I can understand that who we are. I think a new perspective for me is how we are seen. Okay. And I love the way you brought the will and the skill part in this game. I was just doing my own research, Tasha, and um, I realized that you have mentioned somewhere there are two kinds of awareness, internal and external. Tell me more about that. I'm just wondering if it is connected to what you just spoke about, who we are and how we are seen. So if there's any connection or if there's any bridge between these two parallels.
You're exactly right. So the two components of that definition I just gave, who we are and how we're seen, incorporate the two elements of self-awareness. So another way to think about this is like two camera angles of self-awareness. It's important for us to internally know, what do we value? What are our passions? What are our patterns of behavior over time? All those sort of internal things about what makes us tick. But at the same time, unless we live in a cardboard box and never talk to anyone, it's equally important to understand how other people perceive us. And that's not right or wrong. It just is, right? People's perceptions are what they are. And that's the external self-awareness component of, can I read a room? Can I step outside of my own perspective to understand what other people are experiencing? And what's really interesting about these two camera angles or two elements of self-awareness is there is no relationship between them. So what that means really practically for us is just because I'm high on one doesn't mean I'm going to be high on the other. Just because I'm working on one doesn't mean automatically that I'll start to get the other in return. So if we think about our journey, we can get really into this, but if you think about like being high and low on each, or less developed or more developed, you start to get a 2x2 grid. You can be high on both. You can be low on both. You can be high on one, but not the other, right? But the whole purpose is we've got to take the journey almost in parallel. And we don't necessarily have to focus on both of them equally all the time, but we do have to focus on building both, right? That internal, who am I? And externally, how am I seen?
So this is definitely a surprise for me, because I've always believed that the world outside is a true reflection of the world within. What I did not consider is how I'm perceived is different from the way I know myself internally. Am I making sense?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And where does this skill will come in the game?
So I think it's two things, if we deconstruct it, will and skill. The will is a simple commitment to work on our self-awareness, to be that second group of executive who isn't just fighting daily fires. The good news is when we start to develop the second part, which is the skill, I think a lot of people misunderstand what the journey of self-awareness really entails. They imagine, oh, I'm going to have to go to therapy 3 times a week. I'm going to have to journal every single day, right? I'm going to have to mindfully meditate for hours and hours on end. But what we discovered in our research by looking at people who became self-aware but didn't start out that way is that they really found almost like daily hacks, very efficient ways on a daily basis to increase their self-awareness incrementally. And that's really the name of the game. It's not, I'm going to sit here and journal for 3 hours. It's, what if I sit down and journal and I ask myself one really powerful question and I write for 5 or 10 minutes? Because the beauty of this, and we discovered at almost a rate of 2 to 1, the most powerful self-awareness or insight producing moments aren't these huge light bulb moments where like all of a sudden we understand everything.
Yeah.
They're just small incremental improvements. Like, oh, I noticed that this is a dumb example, but like, I noticed that when I haven't eaten lunch, I get very snippy with my coworkers,
Yeah.
right? So it's those small things. And if you improve your self-awareness 1% every week, just think about the sum total impact of that.
Yeah.
And I think it makes the journey a lot less daunting, doesn't it?
Yeah.
If we think,
Yeah.
oh, I can definitely do 1%.
Oh,
That's definitely
absolutely,
within my
Tasha.
reach.
Absolutely. I didn't know that how I could work on myself when I realized that there's so many areas that I need to work on. And the journey to further develop my self-awareness has been extremely, excruciatingly painful for me
Oh no.
because I would continue to fall. I would continue to get into the same traps. I would continue to give the same reactive patterns that would not create an ease around me. And I would not be an ease to be with. I would be rather a painful. I was in a very bad state, to tell you the truth, Tasha. Very,
Mm.
very bad, painful space I was in. Now, before we even talk about, you spoke about there are some daily hacks that if we can identify for ourselves, they can help us to improve our self awareness. Now, before we get there, help me understand what are the myths that people have around self awareness? That it's very important for us to identify, recognize, and take one step forward in that direction.
Mhm. Let me start with one that I think is very common when I speak, I get to speak to audiences all around the world about this topic. And inevitably somebody will raise their hand and say, "Okay, Tasha, I know you're saying self-awareness is the meta skill of the 21st century. It's the most important foundational competency that we can build. But isn't there such thing as being too self-aware?" And I think it's a really fair question, right? We have this, at least in the US, like this Woody Allen figure of almost being neurotic, where you're overanalyzing yourself. And the good news about that is that's not actually self-awareness.
Mm.
When we're ruminating and overanalyzing and judging and hating ourselves, that's called self-loathing
Yeah.
or self-consciousness. What we've discovered in our research, we and others, is that people who are self-aware are actually very high on self-acceptance.
Self
And I think
acceptance.
about one of our research subjects that we interviewed who said, a lot of times in this journey of self-awareness, I have had to learn to love the person that
Yeah.
I find out I am, just
Yeah.
as much as I've had to learn who I am in general.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is if we can stay away from those kind of ruminative thought patterns, the more self-awareness we build, the more we're able to accept ourselves for the good, the bad, and the very ugly every once in a while, right? We've all been there. So that's one myth.
Mm.
Another myth is that all introspection will lead to self-awareness. And this
Mm.
is something that actually early on in our research program, I almost abandoned the research program because I was finding these results and these patterns of data that were suggesting that the more people introspected, right, the more they self-reflected, the less self-aware they were, and the less happy, the more stressed, the more depressed, the more anxious they were.
Let me just reframe it.
Mhm.
Self introspection is not directly proportionate to self awareness, and thus it's not directly proportionate to the happiness as well.
Correct, because
Why do you say
self-awareness
so?
leads to that. So I don't say so, the data say so.
Okay.
We did a study early on in our research program where we it was very simple, and I was kind of doing it just to check a box because I knew what the answer would be. We surveyed about 300 people on how much time they spent introspecting or self-reflecting, how self-aware they were, and then these outcomes, right? Like life satisfaction, being in control of your life, being satisfied with your relationships, and so on. And of course, the people that self-reflected would be better off on both categories, right? Of course. When I got the
At
data
least
back,
that's what I would
yeah,
imagine.
it's what any, and I'm an introspection nerd, right? So I thought, of
Yeah.
course, that's what we're going to find. That's why I'm writing this book, Insight.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, the results were completely the opposite.
Hmm.
And I thought, how could this be? How could the more time we spend reflecting not just lead to less self-awareness, but make us worse off in our lives? Then I
Hmm.
started to think maybe I should write a book about self-delusion, right? That maybe that's the
Hmm.
direction I should be going.
Yeah.
But ultimately, by going back to others' research and collecting more data, here's what we found. We found that it's not that introspection in and of itself is bad.
Hmm.
It's that most of us are doing it incorrectly. And that
Hmm.
ties back to the first myth that I talked about, right? Where we get into this rumination, where we're
Yeah.
judging ourselves or we're non-productively reflecting in a way that isn't giving us forward moving, action oriented insight. It's just making us feel terrible about ourselves.
Hmm.
And the simplest way I can distill this for your listeners is what we found in those people that didn't start out self aware but became self aware is that they asked different questions when they were
Hmm.
introspecting. And what
Yeah.
it boiled down to was instead of asking themselves why, they
Uh-huh.
were asking themselves what. So if you
Ah,
think about it, probably the most common introspective question that any of us ask ourselves is why, right? Why am I
why
in
am
a
I
bad
sad?
mood? Yeah,
Yeah. Why
why
am
am
I
I
sad?
sad?
Yeah.
Why did that meeting not go well? Why did I have a fight with my spouse? But there's several reasons that is an unproductive question. Number one is a lot of times when we're looking for our unconscious thoughts and motives and feelings, despite what Sigmund Freud told us, human beings can't access so much of our unconsciousness. And what we do is we find an answer that feels true, but that is very often wrong,
Hmm.
right? And so that's why it leads us away from self-awareness. The reason it makes our lives worse is why kicks us into what I call the rabbit hole of rumination.
I can so
And
much
here's
relate
what
to
that
that.
is. Can you, yeah, I'm curious. Tell me, what does the rabbit hole of rumination look like to you?
If you ask me why am I sad, then I can tell you 10 different reasons why am I sad.
Mm.
So rather than asking why question, I think that's a beautiful distinction. We need to ask what question. You said something so beautiful that we can't find enough of our unconscious anyways. It reminds me of what Carl Jung said. He said, unless you bring your unconscious to your conscious, it would continue to drive your life
Mm.
and you would call it fate. Having said that, uh, what do you propose, Tasha? What are those few techniques that I can share with my audience that might help them develop that awareness, move what's going on in their unconscious, which is not serving them, to bring it to their conscious so that tomorrow they don't blame their fate?
I love Carl Jung. And I actually talk about a lot of his work in my new book, Shatterproof, which is coming out next year.
You
Um,
said shadow proof,
shatterproof. Like
shatterproof. Wow.
I can crack or I can break, but I will not shatter. Um,
Wow.
and and I really want to distinguish sort of the two routes towards self-awareness, because unfortunately, Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud believed that we could access that unconsciousness or unconscious, but it's not as simple as that. And a lot of
It's not at
neuroscience
all
research
simple.
has showed us. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But so if there is anyone who's listening to this who is experiencing depression, anxiety, symptoms of trauma, there are an incredible number of therapeutic modalities. I want to preface this by saying that I'm not a clinical psychologist, I'm an organizational psychologist, but I have personally gone through a lot of these modalities
Hmm.
from my own trauma in my life. There are things called EMDR, emotion transformation therapy, right? That actually rewire our brains from, these unconscious, traumas or reactions or patterns into more healthy ways of living.
Yeah.
So again, EMDR. I recently was able to experience emotion transformation therapy, ETT. So there's a lot there, and I don't want to conflate those two things, right? Like if you need to heal your trauma or your depression or your anxiety, really think about finding a good therapist or somebody
Mm.
who is experienced in those modalities. If you're looking for, self-awareness in addition to those modalities, this is the couple of kind of ideas I can give your listeners. So where should we start? What do you think?
Um, Let me ask you this question. You said that you have gone through certain traumas in your life. Uh, if I were to invite you at that point in time, whatever you were dealing with, uh, what are the possible steps that you wish you had for yourself that would have helped you? Let's start from there.
Mm. I mean, I would go back to finding a scientifically supported approach to
Mhm.
healing that trauma as quickly as possible.
Mm.
Because one thing, and now we're getting into Shatterproof to my new book, this is a lot of what I talk about there. One
Mm.
thing we know about trauma is it's not just a psychological injury, it's
Mhm.
an injury to our nervous system,
Yeah.
right? And so what happens is we're activated, we're fighting, we're fleeing, we're freezing, because those are our hardest wired survival instincts coming into play. It's our bodies trying to protect us.
Yeah.
But our bodies keep telling us, every day that after we've lived this trauma, that we're about to die. We're getting
Yeah.
chased by a bear. We've got to run away. And so I think, just swiftly dealing with that trauma and not saying, I'm strong, I'm resilient, I
No.
can get through this. Because every day that we're not treating that trauma, it's making it more difficult for our brains to heal
Precisely.
themselves, right? Yeah.
Precisely.
So we're healing our brains. And I think that's, if I could go back in time to, my earliest challenges, and we've all had them, right?
Yeah.
To just say it's not about being strong. It's not about enduring. It's
Yeah.
about getting help and getting good help.
Yeah. 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 And thank you for bringing that element in the conversation, Tasha. When you said that human beings, they cannot decipher between a threat to their body, to their physical self, or a threat to their identity. Gabor Maté has done a lot of good work in that space. He says that trauma is not what happens to you, it is what happens to you inside as a response to what's happening outside of you.
Mm.
And whatever you're reacting to in this moment is not a reaction to this situation, it's a reaction to something that you've experienced in the past. In your understanding, Tasha, if you can give an example of trauma, does it need to be a big trauma always, or a minor injury to your nervous system, as you mentioned, would have the same impact as a trauma would have it?
So I tell this story in Shatterproof, my new book, and it's kind of a silly story, but if you peel the layers of the onion, it makes sense. So this was maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, and my friends had this tradition of, before COVID, of Thursday night happy hour. And every Thursday night we'd go somewhere great, and we'd go early, and we'd get these great specials on our food and our beverages, and it was, you could set your clock by Thursday night happy hour. But I had noticed that over the last couple of months, my friends were increasingly, finding they were out of town or they had other plans. And, maybe Thursday night happy hour wasn't as important to them as it was to
Mm.
me. And one night I was so excited. Had been a very stressful week, and Thursday night happy hour was on. I was so, so excited. But as I was leaving my apartment and getting on the elevator to go to Thursday night happy hour, I get a text from my friend Sue, and she said, "Tasha, I am so sorry. Mike and I can't make it. We've got to go adopt a cat." And I was like, she must be joking. This is the weirdest reason to cancel at the last minute I could possibly imagine. I said,
Mm.
"I'm sorry, what?" And she told us they had been looking to adopt a cat and they found the perfect cat, but they had to go that night or the cat would be gone tomorrow. I was furious. I'm
Mm.
talking like screaming, like, throwing things, just had this incredibly disproportionate reaction to a good friend having to cancel through no fault of their own, right? And it was so bad that I didn't even speak to her for several months.
Mm.
And so at some point, another friend intervened and said, Tasha, why don't we go to dinner, kind of talk about what's going on with you and Sue? And I was like, well, you can talk about it, but I am not
Mm.
forgiving her. She is a terrible friend, and I have to protect myself from this happening in the future, right?
Mm.
So we go to dinner, and she kind of says, we're talking about it, and I explained what happened, and my friend said, oh, that sounds really painful. Um, but I'm wondering, do you think this is really about Sue adopting a cat, or is it maybe about something else? And as I was sort of astonished by the insight that she had just given me and the homework and the challenge that she had just assigned, right? And as I'm walking home, I started to think about, okay, when else have I felt like this in my life? When else have I felt abandoned, unimportant, cast aside, forgotten, ignored, right? And instantly I got pains in my stomach, right? And you have this like physiological response. And I thought back to my childhood when my parents divorced, my dad had a new family, and they would leave me out of everything. Not intentionally, right? But they would go on vacations without me, or they would make plans and cancel them at the last minute, and sort of all of this really difficult stuff to deal with as a kid. And I said, that's when I felt that way. And I instantly realized that, this sort of relatively minor slight that I experienced from my friend wasn't really about that. It was
Mm.
about this sort of long held, I would use the word trauma. We could also use the word like trigger, right? That made me hyper reactive to things that felt similar. And again, they felt
Yeah.
similar in my body. I didn't even know that it was similar until I started kind of processing it a little bit. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think that's a great example of sometimes we have these totally disproportionate reactions to things, and we're
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
what is wrong with me? Right? What
Yeah.
is my problem? And I
Yeah.
think there's room for grace and compassion and curiosity in those moments.
By the way, how are you feeling right now as you were just sharing this?
Interestingly, since I've done some of these therapeutic modalities, I feel I don't feel like my brain is going offline, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I feel in control. I still feel the
Yeah.
feelings,
You still
but
have
it's
that
within,
awareness.
right.
You are
But
aware
I'm
of
in
what's happening to you.
control.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah.
It's
I
a
can so much
psychologist
relate to
called,
that, Tasha. Uh, and I can't thank you enough for giving me this time to have a conversation with you one on one. You know, I've been biting my nails for almost like 40 years. For as long as I've known myself, I would experience so much of shame, be it a webinar, be it a conversation like this, or every time when I'm interviewing somebody in person. I would hide my fingers like this
Mhm.
so that nobody can see what's happening. A couple of months back, something happened. I was having this conversation with one of my teachers, and he said, Gaurav, it's high time. You should stop biting your nails. Next day, Neer, my daughter, she had her fingers in her mouth. And as much as I wanted to tell her, pull your finger out of your mouth, come on, Neer. But a part of me stopped me. I did not feel that I deserve to call out this for Neer. I felt as if it's unfair to ask her to pull out her hands, her fingers from her mouth, especially when Gaurav is asking. And then this conversation happened with my teacher, right? You won't believe that, Tasha. Next day onwards, I did not bite my nails. And I was talking to myself. I said, how did that happen? This is nothing less than a miracle. It's not that today I don't get this trigger to put my finger or to put my nails in my mouth. But the moment I do that, I get that awareness. And awareness creates possibilities. Awareness creates choices in our life.
Right.
And as I often share with people, that you can never kill your reactive patterns. You cannot kill the beast that you have nurtured for so many years, but you can always tame them. And I think in order to tame that beast within, I need to be aware. I need to be aware. So, Tasha, what are the other ways that you share with your audience, family members, who are your family members, who are your friends, that could possibly help them build awareness?
So let me give you two. One is for internal self-awareness. One is for external self-awareness. For internal self-awareness, I call it the daily check-in. And we discovered when we interviewed, remember those people who didn't start out self-aware, but who became remarkably more self-aware, that they all had some version of this as ideally a daily commitment, or, you know, in a more pragmatic sense, like most days. So if you can do this more days than you don't do this, it's going to dramatically improve your internal self-awareness. And the way it's designed is to prevent you from getting into that rabbit hole of rumination,
Yeah.
right? Of overanalyzing. So at the end of every day, when you're, you know, getting ready for bed, when you're brushing your teeth, you know, when you're coming home from work, you just ask yourself 3 questions. So the first question is, what went well today? The second question, what didn't go so well? The third question, how can I be smarter tomorrow? And you can feel free to insert any other word you want that is authentic to you. If you don't like smarter, it could be happier, more productive, more centered, more calm, right? Whatever it is you're focused on. But I like smarter because it implies kind of a continuous improvement mindset. What I love about these questions is they take less than 5 minutes to ponder.
Yeah.
You can just think about it in your mind. You can journal. You can talk to a loved one. And they help you have in your mind for the next day, like, how can I live a little bit better? Because that's
Exactly.
ultimately what this is about, right? Is having a little bit better of a life through self-awareness.
Precisely.
Going back to what you just said, right? I think that's so powerful. So that's the first tool. I'm curious, have you ever found yourself doing anything like that, even if you didn't call it by name, the daily check-in?
I don't call it daily check-in. However, before I sleep, I meditate. And I close my eyes and look at what went well, what could be done differently. I think another powerful question that I'm going to definitely add in my set of questions is like, how could I be more smarter tomorrow? One of the questions that, Tasha, that I often ask myself is, how can I be an ease to be with?
I love that.
Yeah. And be it my conversations with my team members, be it my conversations with my clients, I think that's a question that I ask myself. How can I be an ease to be with? I think
That's
that opens
beautiful.
up.
That's, if I may,
Of
my
course,
teacher, Marshall Goldsmith, who I'm sure you're familiar with, he's the
he's
number
been on
one
this
leadership
podcast
thinker
as
and
well.
coach. There you go.
Yeah.
He's my honorary dad. He always talks about his goal of, how can I make this person's life a little bit better because I was
Yeah.
in it. And I love, how can I be an ease to be with? How can I make other people's lives a little bit better? It's this mentality of service, and service requires awareness, because
Absolutely.
if we default to our reactions, right, we're going to get selfish. We're going to get self-centered. And I
Yeah.
think that's what allows us to serve.
Yeah. 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 I told you about the work that I'm doing on the 3 basic desires of a human soul: expression, connection, and contribution. And in expression, I talk about self-awareness, because expression begins when you're aware of your superpowers, when you're aware of your gifts, when you're aware of the talents that you've been blessed with. And when you start to express from your core, that's where you'll be able to connect with others, because you're not operating from a space of scarcity.
Mhm.
And once you're able to connect with the other person, not from a space of scarcity, but from the space of whole and complete, you'll be able to contribute as well.
Mm.
And when you bring these 3 pillars together, three basic desires of a human soul together: the express, connect, and contribute. Uh, you'll be able to create a bigger impact in the organization or the teams that you're working with. Tasha, you do a lot of work with so many leaders. Just curious, why do you think self awareness is so challenging to develop and maintain, even for experienced leaders?
It's so difficult, and the research shows that the higher up you get, the more power you have, the more people you're leading, the more visible you are, the less self-aware you tend to become, even if you don't start out less self-aware. And I think, the first step for any person, but particularly any leader, is to acknowledge that truth, is to, I call it gently stop assuming that you are self-aware. My research and my experience teach me that the number one barrier to achieving self-awareness is believing that we already are. And so particularly for leaders, right? You think about it, think about the CEO of a company. Is anyone telling the CEO of a company that he was a jerk in their earnings call or in their town hall meeting? No. They're like, Mr. CEO, Ms. CEO, that was great. That was your best earnings call or your best town hall ever. They're getting only the good news. They're not getting the tough stuff. It's not because they're bad people or they don't want feedback. It's just by the nature of power and power imbalances.
Yeah.
So I think for leaders, especially, to say the default is, I am not as self-aware as I believe that I am, opens us up to a whole new level of curiosity and humility, right? Another reason that we're not self-aware is we're actually wired to sort of have mental shortcuts and how we deal with our world. There's some research that shows that at any given moment, we're literally dealing with several million pieces of information coming at us, stimuli, environmental thoughts, like anything, right? And so our brains developed to cut through that complexity. And one of the ways to cut through that complexity is to not say, let me think about what I just said, right? We're just thinking, what's the next thing I'm going to say? And so that's another piece of it, is it's our hard wiring. The third big contributor, and this is true for everyone, whether or not they're leaders, is something I call the cult of self. And the cult of self is something that is happening in all age groups across the world. And it's this increasing idea that I am somehow special, unique, that other people want to know everything about me, that they want to know what I ate for breakfast on Facebook, right? And obviously more individualistic countries like, the United States or Canada are more susceptible. But there's a lot of evidence worldwide that there are low-level increases in narcissism as each year goes by. It doesn't mean we're narcissists, but if you give somebody an inventory of narcissistic behaviors, it means that we're edging upwards in how sort of self-centered we're becoming. And this goes back to what I said earlier. When we're self-centered, we can't be self-aware, right? So those are kind of the three big barriers that I typically see. And again, for leaders, you've just got to be especially careful. But it's a cautionary tale for all of us.
And you mentioned that the percentage of narcissist traits inside us, the percentage is growing with every passing year. Why?
Well, so to me, I take it back to that cult of self mentality. So if you think about things like social media, technology, reality TV, even demographic trends, and I'm not familiar with local trends in your area, but I know that worldwide, there's sort of a lessening of like collective social rituals where we're, coming together as a community less and less often. In the US, for example, more people live alone than they've ever lived alone before. So there's sort of these internal and external forces that, if think about it, if you live alone, and this is an extreme example, but if you live alone, you don't feel like you're a part of a community, you're not getting that social feedback. And you do get more narcissistic because it's really, it's just you in a sense. And even if that's not the case, every time you log on to Facebook or Instagram or, whatever, and you're seeing this sort of look at me behavior from other people, which is how most people use social media, being
Mm.
a me former, uh, you start to think, oh, subconsciously or not consciously, maybe I should be like that too.
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
people want to know what I ate for breakfast, right? So
Yeah.
it's
At
so
the,
many things. It's hard to separate out, but it's a very
yeah.
clear trend.
Tasha, you spoke about one of the ways is, as you mentioned, what went well, what did not go well, how can I be smarter tomorrow? That was one of the techniques to build awareness. What's the second one you spoke about that you were about to share too with me?
I'm very glad to come back to that because I bet your listeners are like, when are we going to get that second tool?
Yes.
Very self-aware. So it's called the Dinner of Truth, and it's designed to improve your external self-awareness as well as to shore up one of your most important relationships. So
Mm,
here's the reality that we live in every day. The people that we spend the most time with and that we love the most often have a significant amount of information about how we're coming across that could help us, but they rarely give it to us,
mm,
right? So they're sitting on critical feedback. So
mm,
the question becomes, what's a simple way that I can keep that feedback flowing?
mm.
And this is an exercise developed by a communications professor in the States named Josh Meisner. And he actually he's done this for years and years and years with literally like probably by now tens of thousands of his undergrad students. What you do is you pick someone who is important to you, with whom you want to improve your relationship. And you take them out for coffee or chai or for a meal. Dinner is good if, you want to just like relax at the end of the day. And you ask them the following question. You ready?
Yes.
What, what do I do that is most annoying to you?
Mm.
And then you listen.
Mm.
Now, if any of your listeners are like me, the first time I heard of this exercise from Dr. Meisner, my stomach dropped out of my body.
Yeah.
I imagined, sitting there with, my best friend or my mom or, anyone that I'm close to and hearing and having that moment after I asked them the question. What's really interesting is that, first of all, I'd never ask any of my readers or my clients to do anything that I haven't done myself. And I've done this exercise probably at least a dozen times now. And what I'm constantly amazed by is, or what amazes me about this exercise is that their answer is never as bad as I
Mm.
fear it will be.
Yeah.
So, as an example, the first time I did this, I intentionally picked kind of a crotchety, cynical friend because I wanted to get like the worst possible,
Mm.
experience of it to see if I could do it. And I picked my friend Mike, who's married to Sue, the cat person from my
You
story
mentioned,
before.
yeah.
Yes. And he said, that's a great question. He thought for a second. And I thought he was going to say, I never liked you. I'm so glad that you asked me this because I don't really even like being around you. It's all of our worst fears, right? You know what he said? He said, I love you in real life. I hate you on social media. This
Mm.
was about 12 or 13 years ago. And I said, interesting. Tell me more. And what I discovered was that in my enthusiasm to sort of build my following as a, kind of an early thought leader
Yeah.
in that career, is that I was making everything about me.
Yeah.
And he said, that's not who you are at all. And I said, you're right. Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. And what's cool about the Dinner of Truth, in addition to, getting something usually very actionable and helpful, is that it strengthens those relationships. It
Yeah.
takes a lot of vulnerability for you to
Mm.
ask, and it takes just as much for them to answer your question. So
Yeah.
it's kind of a trust building exercise in and of itself. So even if you're listening to this and you're feeling like, oh my God, I could never do that, I would challenge you, just try it once. And
Mm.
I think you'll find that it's not just transformational for your self-awareness, it can be transformational for your relationships too.
Let's take one step forward. When we start to build something, we have to pay the price. Only then something comes to us. What was that truth that was most difficult for you to embrace
Hmm.
before you surrendered yourself to this work?
What was the truth that was most difficult for me to embrace before I surrendered myself to this work? Here's one that I keep learning over and over, but I think I'm getting
Mm.
better at, is that as a recovering people pleaser, it doesn't actually matter what every person in the world thinks of me.
Mm.
So that's an example of, self-awareness turning into self-criticism, right? I
Yeah.
was, my goodness, I've done 2 TEDx talks. I'm so honored and humbled that, millions of people have watched them. The first time I did one of these, I would go on the YouTube page where it was posted and I would read the comment
Mm.
under this delusional idea that, I needed the feedback. But what I've realized is feedback is hugely important, obviously, right? I'm a self-awareness researcher. I have to model that, but
Mm.
not all sources of feedback
Not
are
all
accurate
sources of feedback, extremely
or
important.
important. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think for me, I just, as a recovering people pleaser, I'll never be fully recovered. I just
Yeah.
want everyone to like me. And
Yeah.
what I've realized is that's not self-awareness, right? That is not the path of self-awareness.
Yeah.
The path of self-awareness is being the captain of my feedback ship.
Yeah. And I love the word recovering people pleaser. For as long as I can remind myself that I'm on the path to get better at that, the chances of me slipping
Hmm.
would be less.
Hmm.
It would be less. So, Tasha, you mentioned that you've been a people pleaser, right? And we all have been. There are there are traits that we get into, and then we find it extremely important to get out of that. How would you, and what would be your piece of advice to those who make a sincere effort to get better at that?
I'm going to say something that might seem a little controversial, but at the end of the day, the only person's self-awareness we can control is our own. It doesn't mean that
Mm.
we shouldn't try to help other people. It just means that very often, if the person isn't ready to hear it, and or if we're not the right messenger, and or if we deliver it in a way that's not helpful to them, um, they might not be able
Mm.
or willing to sort of meet us where we are.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
I think there are some situations where that there's an exception to that rule. So let's say you're a parent and you've accidentally raised a narcissist, right? Or you're a supervisor and you have employees working with you. Those are situations where it's kind of in your job description. But if it's not the case, I spent so many years trying to change all of the people in my life that were disappointing me. And
And
strangely,
it's painful.
year after year after year, I would get more upset and they would get more dug in. And there was a point at which I just said, for a couple of relationships in particular, I have to give this up. I have to do, if anybody's watching this on a video, what Marshall Goldsmith teaches us, right? You put your hand over your head and you just let it go. And strangely, in a couple of those relationships, once I did that, we were able to have a more functional relationship. And so I think this idea of like, am I really trying to make someone more self-aware? Or am I trying to change someone who
Mm.
doesn't want to change? And I don't know about you, but for me, if I was really honest with myself, a lot of times I wasn't trying to make them more self-aware. I was
Yeah, I
trying
was
to
trying
get
to
them to
change
be
their
to behave the
behavior.
way I wanted them to be. Right.
Yeah, it's
So
more
so
of a
that would be my
controlling
advice.
behavior.
Yeah,
It's more of a
exactly. Exactly.
controlling behavior. And I would say I'm I'm one recovering anti-controlling behavior. Uh, yeah. Tasha, how do you measure self-awareness? I'm sure you would have come across this situation very frequently. But are there
Yes.
ways to measure self-awareness?
Yes. So we can know what's consciously knowable. And luckily there's a lot that's consciously
Mm,
knowable. Yeah, and maybe this will be kind of the last answer I give you. I'll say two things about this. The first is our team spent almost 7 years empirically validating a 70 plus item multi-rater assessment of self-awareness. It's not commercially available right now. It's available for research purposes, but there is a 14 item subset of that quiz. That's a pretty good representation of kind of the overall that you can take for free in 5
mm,
minutes online. If you go to www.insight-quiz.com, so insight-quiz.com, what you do is it takes you about 5 minutes, fill it
mm.
out. You're covering the 7 pillars of self-awareness, right? All of the things that we know about ourselves when we know who we are. But you can't be the only one who fills it out, right? We know that external self-awareness is just as important. So the system will automatically send an assessment to someone you choose who knows you well. They fill it out, and then you get your results back with kind of a high-level picture of your internal and external
Got it.
self-awareness, as
Mm,
well as 2 or 3 really practical things you can do right away if you decide you want to improve. So that's
yeah.
the first thing I'll say. So that's more practical. What's more philosophical is, a lot of people ask me this, like, okay, self-awareness. Basically, when they ask, like, how do I measure my self-awareness? In some sense, they're asking, is there ever a point at which I can be done?
Mm.
Right? Am I ever done developing my
Yeah.
self-awareness? And the response I would give goes back to one of our research subjects who said, becoming more self-aware is like exploring space. And
Yeah.
what I love about it and what makes it so exciting is no matter what we know, there's always more to discover.
Yeah.
So no
Yeah.
matter where you are in your journey, a lot of like very technical people like me, you might want to put a number to it. But wherever you are, as long as you are moving forward, that's all that
It's a good
matters in
space
the
to be.
end. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. Super, Tasha. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your experience, your wisdom, and all the work that you have done in the space of self-awareness. I think, as I often share, the best gift that you can offer to yourself or to others is the gift of self-awareness. So thank you for this beautiful gift. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaurav. It was a pleasure.